Over the next 2 chapters, we'll be looking at constructing objects from shapes or from curves. And we'll be working with these curves here, for example, these primitives and also freeform lines. And then we'll use those to construct something called a loft. And that's what you see here. This art glass piece has been created as a loft from these 3 shapes. I'm going to go ahead and reset 3ds Max and start from scratch and restore 3ds Max back to default settings, as if you had closed the program and reopened it. And now I've got a blank scene. I'm going to hide that view cube too while I'm at it. Before I begin, I want to set up my units of measurement. Customize unit setup. Because this object is going to be pretty small to fit on a tabletop, I can go ahead and use inches as my default units and click OK. Next, I'll want to set up the grid. Right-click on any one of the magnet icons on the main toolbar and go to Home Grid. I'll have a minor grid line every 1 inch by setting the grid spacing to 1. Press the Tab key. And I want a major grid line every 12 inches or every 1 foot. I'll set major lines every nth grid line to 12. And in the perspective view, I'll set it to 24 inches. And now I've got a stage in the perspective view that's 24 inches from center to edge. And this is how I can set it up for imperial units in inches. Now I'm ready to create some shapes. For that art glass vase, I need a circle and a star. The shapes are found in the Create panel in their own subpanel labeled Shapes. 3ds Max considers a shape to be a spline or a curve. And we've got shape primitives, such as a circle. I'll click and create this in the top view just because that's the most convenient. It doesn't really matter where I create it. It's just cleaner and neater in the scene if I create it in the top viewport. I'll right-click to exit creation and then immediately go to the Modify panel. And take a look at this. I've got a radius of 1 foot 5 inches, and it's not even anywhere close to my perspective view grid. This is just part of the byproduct of working in 3ds Max because the grid is adaptive. If I zoom forward or back with the wheel, you'll notice that the lines of the grid adapt to the distance that I'm at. So as I go further out, eventually those minor lines disappear. That can make it kind of difficult for you to figure out how large things are. Just make sure you're checking the numeric values, and if you need to, you can make a reference box that's 1 foot on a side or something like that. I'm going to set this to 2 inches in radius. Type in a 2 and press Enter, and then I'll move it nearer to the center of the world just by grabbing the Move tool, typing in some zeros down here in this Transform Type In area. X of 0, Tab, and Y of 0. Now it's centered on the world. Move it over a little bit. That's easy enough. It's a circle. Nothing more to that. I'll go back to the Create panel, and I'll also make a star primitive. Click on Star, and drag that out in the top view. And when I release the mouse, 3ds Max is also expecting me to set other parameters, not just 1 radius, but also a second radius. I'll click again to set that second radius. Now I've created the star. If I'm finished, I'll right-click to exit star creation. You might need to right-click twice. I can go into the Modify panel and adjust the star parameters. For example, the number of points. Maybe I just want 5 points. It'd also be nice if these weren't so hard-edged. I want a rounded corner on these. I can do that by adjusting these fillet radius values. Fillet radius 1 is the outer corners. Fillet radius 2 is the inner corners. Just make sure that you don't push this too far because you'll get interesting results. In other words, the shape is now self-intersecting. That's not going to work in this case, so I want to have a very small fillet radius for both radius 1 and radius 2. That's all there is to it to create shapes in 3ds Max. We've created a couple of spline primitives, also known as shapes, in 3ds Max. I also want to create a freeform line that I can edit and make any shape that I want. Before I do that, I'm going to zoom all viewports to enclose all geometry because I'm not sure where I am in the front view or left view. If I want to zoom all the viewports so that all of the objects are visible, I can hold down Shift, Control, and press the Z key. Control Shift Z zooms all viewports to enclose all geometry. And now I know in the front view that I'm more or less in the right zone, even if I can't see the object selected. And I'm going to make my object about a foot tall. So I zoom back a little bit. And remember, I set the grid earlier to show inches and feet. This is about 1 foot in height here. And I'll go over to the Create panel, and under Shapes, I'll click Line. I'll start at the bottom and click once to create a point. And I'll just go up here about a foot up in the air and click again to create a second point. And I'm done making points, therefore I'll right-click, and that will exit that particular object. And I can right-click again to complete line creation. Now, if you look closely on this, it's not perfect. I tried my level best to click on the center here, but I didn't quite make it. This will give me an opportunity to show you how to use snaps. I'll do that over again by deleting that. Press the Delete key on the keyboard to delete that object. And I'll turn on snaps. If I click on the 3D magnet icon, by default, that'll allow me to snap to grid intersections. However, you might want to right-click on that just to make sure that grid points is the only item chosen in the snaps. Once again, I'll click Line, and as I move my mouse around, you'll see that I get a nice big yellow snap icon. Click once to create the first point, click again to create the second point, and then right-click to finish the line, and right-click again to exit the line tool. Now, you may notice that you see some funny business here with the line, and it may not display well because this selection bracket is kind of hiding it. Don't be alarmed by that. And you also might notice that the grid and the snaps sometimes don't play well together. But if I just turn the snaps off, everything should be fine. I'll dolly back in my perspective view, and I've got a line. Perfectly straight. And it's because I clicked and did not drag the mouse when I created the line. Just to illustrate, if I go click on line and hold down the mouse as I create, you'll see I'm getting curved lines. We don't want that this time. We just want a straight line. So I'll delete that. That's all there is to creating a line in 3ds Max. And next we'll work with it and change its shape. We've got 3 shapes in our scene. 2 out of 3 of those are still primitives. For example, this star. I'm going to reduce the radius a little bit, and then I'll convert it to editable spline, which will collapse its modifier stack, delete all parameters, and allow me to select individual points. I'll maximize the view with Alt-W and press the Z key to zoom in on that star. If it's selected, I can right-click anywhere in the viewport and choose Convert to Editable Spline. As soon as I release the mouse, you'll see that it's no longer a star primitive. It's now a different type of object, editable spline. Very similar to what we saw in the last chapter with converting a 3D primitive into editable poly. It's the basic same idea here. And now I can actually go in and select individual points. Click on Vertex Sub-Object Mode, either in the selection rollout here or in the sub-object modes in the stack. And then I can select individual points and move them around using the Move tool. I definitely want to do this in the top viewport, and that's because if I move these points in the front or left viewports, it wouldn't be flat anymore. And I want it to remain flat. Now I've got an asymmetrical shape. I'll exit out of sub-object mode. And I'd also like to show to you the fact that the line that we created previously is the same object type as this converted editable spline. I'll hit Alt-W to go back to my 4 viewport layout and click on the line, and you'll notice that the Modify panel here looks the same. In fact, let me make this a little bit bigger by pulling this out. And you'll see that these two have all of the same tools. This one started its life out as a freeform line. This one started out as a shape that was converted. But they both end up being the same thing, which is an editable spline. Don't be thrown off by the fact that this one says line up here, and this one says editable spline, because in fact, those are just 2 different names for the same thing. In the next movie, we'll look in a little bit more detail at controlling the shape of an editable spline. To get full control over the shape of an editable spline, you'll also need to work with vertex types. There are 4 different types of vertices on an editable spline. If I go into vertex subobject mode for my star and select some of these, you'll see that they're all Bezier points. Grab the Move tool and move these little green handles around, and that indicates that it's a Bezier curve or Bezier vertex. You're probably familiar with that from a program like Illustrator or Photoshop. Almost all computer graphic programs have some implementation of the classic Bezier spline, which has incoming and outgoing handles to adjust the shape of the curve on either side of the vertex. In 3ds Max, we have other types of vertices as well. To convert between vertex types, just select one or more vertices and then right-click anywhere in the viewport. You'll get the quad menu. And in the upper left quadrant, you can choose a different vertex type. For example, corner. If I choose a corner point, then it's a sharp corner. I'll do this one too. Right-click, choose corner. And a segment between 2 points will be a straight line if both of those points are corner points. So if all you need are straight lines, you can just select all the points and convert them to corner. Another really useful vertex type is smooth. I'll right-click and choose Smooth. And a smooth point, as the name implies, is smooth. It's a nice, soft curve, and it doesn't have any tangent handles for you to worry about. So in some regards, it's simpler. However, you'll notice with a smooth point that it does affect other segments. In other words, I'm moving that point, and it's not just affecting this segment and this one, but it's also affecting segments farther away than you might expect. The 4th type of vertex is a Bezier corner. That's a special case of a Bezier in which the incoming and outgoing tangents are not locked, and I can move them independently. You'll notice, by the way, with a spline, that the transform gizmo does not appear at the location of the tangent handle. And so now as I move this, you'll notice that it's only moving in X. If I needed to move in X and Y, then I can just click in the center of the Move gizmo, and now I'm back to moving in X and Y. I'll convert those back to Bezier. You'll also notice that sometimes the curves become asymmetrical. The handles are different lengths on either side. If you need to restore the handles to be the same length, then you can right-click and convert to Smooth, and then right-click and convert back to Bezier, and now the 2 handles are equally the same length. Get in a little bit closer on that. One last thing I need to mention to you is it may be necessary for you to get rid of the transform gizmo in order to work. Here's an example. Let's say I want to get at this green tangent handle here, and I want to move it left and right. Because it's underneath the transform gizmo, I actually cannot move it in X, because as soon as I click there with my mouse, I'm telling 3ds Max that I want to constrain the movement to Y. So I cannot move it in X if the transform gizmo is directly positioned over the top of it. In this case, I'll need to hide the transform gizmo and use the Axis Constraints toolbar. To hide the gizmo, I'll press the X key on the keyboard. And to get the Axis Constraints toolbar, right-click on the main toolbar and choose Axis Constraints. And now in the Axis Constraints toolbar, I can choose X and Y as my constraints. And now I can edit this as I needed to before. One last point about hiding the transform gizmo. There's a separate command in the Views menu that says Show Transform Gizmo. And if you turn that off, then the transform gizmo and the little axis tripod will also disappear, and you'll be left with nothing. I don't recommend that. Turn that back on again. Just use the X key, which will hide the gizmo but still show you this red axis tripod, so you'll know which constraints you're currently in. Exit out of subobject mode. And that's a little introduction to using different vertex types in an editable spline.